at the Atlanta History Center. It's August 21st, 2007. Mr. Rondem is here for an interview with Veterans Oral History Program. Ronnie, would you please state your name, your date of birth, and your current address, please?
Yes, my name is Ronnie Rondem. My date of birth is 15 July 1943. My current address is 13390 Providence Lake Drive in the new city of Milton, Georgia, 30004.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about your life before you entered military service?
Yes. I was born in Oslo, Norway. I'm Norwegian by birth. I can trace my Norwegian ancestry through to about the 16th century, and on both sides of my family. And I grew up in Norway to age 12, roughly. Emigrated with my parents in 1955. And my grandparents had previously emigrated in 1949, and they lived in Brooklyn, New York. We initially came to Brooklyn, lived with them for approximately 2 months, 3 months, and at that point when I came to the United States, I knew absolutely no English. I take that back. I knew 2 sentences. I knew how to say just one moment, please, and I knew how to say good night, and that was it. And I had to learn the first one because my dad had worked for the American Military Advisory Assistance Group in Norway, and there would be calls in English for him at the house. So if I answered the phone, I had to be able to tell him that, or tell the caller, just one moment please, so I could go and get one of my parents. We grew up in the house that was owned by my maternal grandfather, and he passed away in 1953. And that also had impetus as to why we left or emigrated at that point. My dad had been in the Merchant Marine. He had also been in resistance in Norway during World War II. And on some of his visits in Merchant Marine to the United States to see his parents, he decided that that's what he wanted to do. So we emigrated, and I came to the United States on board a Norwegian-American line passenger ship, and landed in New York on June 3rd, 1955, sailing into New York Harbor before the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge was built, and able to see the Statue of Liberty from the deck. My first real memory of New York City, however, was after we docked, and I looked up on from Pier 42 on the Hudson River on the west side, and I saw the West Side Highway, and I said, gee, those cars are going fast. Another reason why June 3rd is of importance, that was my grandfather's birthday, my paternal grandfather, and he was greeting us at the dock. We lived in Brooklyn, like I said, for approximately 3 months. Then we moved to New Jersey. We lived in New Jersey approximately 2 years, and then moved to New Hampshire. I graduated from high school in New Hampshire in 1961, Manchester High School Central, and I had intentions of going to college. However, I decided that I did not have the maturity to go, and I wasn't sure my parents had the money, and I knew that if I went, I would probably do a little bit more partying than I should have, and therefore not being quite ready to go to college. I went and visited my local recruiter. In fact, the recruiter was in New Brunswick, New Jersey. My parents had moved back to New Jersey at that point. And I enlisted, and I just turned 18. I turned 18 on 15 July, and this was shortly thereafter. So I did not need my parents' consent. And I enlisted to go into the ASA, or the Army Security Agency. And they said, fine. And then I came back to sign my papers, and they said, well, I'm sorry, you can't go in there. because you were an alien. And I said, okay, so now what are my options? And I sat there basically in front of the recruiter and went over the various MOS fields, and he said, well, you qualify for this one and this one and this one. He said, you qualify for any, but the ones that you can't go into as an alien are these. So I said, okay, I think I'll be a medic. So I enlisted and became a medic, went to basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey, in old World War II style barracks. And I still think that that is the best diversity training offered anywhere, is being thrown into a relatively small barracks with 80 people that are about to become some of your closest friends, whether you like them or not. We had a drill sergeant who was actually a acting corporal, and I still remember his name. His name was Witherspoon. And of course we developed various chants for him and had to do with a spoon, various things. But we also learned how to work together and to get the cement floors that were painted red as shiny as he would like to have them. Remember that there were people from various backgrounds throughout primarily the Northeast. One of them was a young Jewish boy named Rosenberg. And Rosenberg came into basic training at the height of about 5'4" and probably weighed 230 pounds. And he had trouble moving the length of the barracks without breathing hard. And we were instructed quite forcefully that in order for us to graduate from basic training, he would have to graduate from basic training, and thereby learning to take care of him and also others that fell into that same category. So it was great team building, great learning. During basic training, I was approached by my company commander, who was the exalted grade of captain at that point, and he decided that I had the qualifications necessary to apply for officer candidate school. I also had the qualification necessary or requisite to apply for the United States Military Academy Prep School. And I said, I don't want to do anything of that nature. So he said, are you sure? I said, I think so. And I didn't. So I finished basic training at Fort Dix, and I was sent to Fort Sam Houston outside or in San Antonio, Texas, and flew down there by plane. And that was one of the first plane trips I had been on in my life. It was the first commercial plane, and landed in San Antonio at it appeared to be a relatively small airport, and which comes back to many years later. I landed there again in the late 80s, early 90s, and boy, had it changed. But anyway, I arrived in San Antonio, went to Fort Sam Houston, and there we also had the old World War II barracks. However, they weren't quite as crowded. Instead of having 80 in the barracks, we probably had more like 40 in the barracks, and it fit a little bit better. Also came into something else while at Fort Sam Houston, and that was we had some old non-commissioned officers, and they were E7s and 8s, that would be Sergeant First Class and Master Sergeants, that had been officers during either World War II or Korea, and then had gotten caught up in a reduction in force that they normally have after wars, and they taught us a little bit about what had happened to them, and as long as they had been commissioned for 10 years, they could retire at the highest rank held. So they had elected to stay in. And also had one that was our postal clerk, and the postal clerk was an E2 or E3. And he was an old guy too. We often wondered why he was an E2 or E3, but we heard some rumors. And then at the end of one of the months, it was probably November, we were all called together for formation to go up to the parade field, where we got to watch our postal clerk retire as a full colonel. He had been an officer in World War II in Korea and had done very well for himself. And however, after he'd been caught in a reduction in force, he decided that he really didn't care that much about having in Iraq anymore. So he had a few problems. He drank a little bit and fought a little bit and kept going down in rank. And he went from being an E2 or E3 to retiring as a colonel, and that was a pretty big impact on many of us. Also at Fort Sam Houston, I came across a man I'd known in Manchester, New Hampshire. We'd gone to high school with him. His name was Roger Giroux. And he and I sort of started running around together. And in fact, we did a fair amount of physical fitness running in the evening. And I finished the medic training, and he finished, and we went off in different directions, except we kept each other's address. About 6 to 8 months after that, I received a letter from Roger, and being in Manchester, New Hampshire, he had grown up and learned to speak French. Going through the Catholic schools there, he had learned French rather than Canadian French, and spoke it well. So he took the Army language test and passed it in French, and he'd been selected to go to work at an embassy in one of the small countries in Africa, part of what used to be the French Equatorial West Africa. And he said, Ronnie, you can't believe this. I came over here. I am the only single male of all the embassy staffs in this city, and there are lots and lots of single stewardesses, secretaries that work there. He said, I'm in heaven. And I sort of said, oh, with a few expletives added. That's the last time I've heard from Roger. So I don't know what happened to him thereafter, but it's sort of an interesting little sidelight. I, however, instead of going to Africa, I went to Fort Bliss, Texas. And they must have thought real highly of me, because I was put in charge of 4 other guys, and I was responsible for getting them onto the bus and for them to stay on the bus from San Antonio to El Paso. If you've ever driven that road, there aren't too many places you want to get off between San Antonio and El Paso, but I'd never seen that kind of country before, and it was very barren. If that wasn't desert, I'd hate to see one. But anyway, it got to Fort Bliss, and there we were in 3-story cement barracks. Boy, were those nice in comparison to what we'd had. There I was assigned to the 6th Battalion, 6th of the 62nd Missile Battalion, Hawk, and that had been constituted, and they were training to be deployed to Germany. And I came there in approximately late January. And at that point, I had just made PFC. And by the way, when I came in the Army, my base pay was $78 a month. When I got to the exalted rank of PFC, it was $99 a month. That's before taxes. So I'm there at Fort Bliss, and I think I'm going to Germany. And they'd interviewed me as well as other people in the unit that were going, and came to know a young man from Vermont, and he and I were both certified ski instructors in I in New Hampshire and he in Vermont. And they said, well, we have a deal for you. When we get to Germany, we are going to send you all up to the Army Recreation Center and have you teach the rest of the unit how to ski. And we said, great. Well, about 2 or 3 weeks after that little interview, I got called down to personnel, and the warrant officer down there said, you can't go to Germany. I said, what do you mean I can't go to Germany? He said, you can't even be in this unit. I said, what do you mean I can't be in this unit? And the same thing came back as when I tried to first enlist into the ASA. I'm an alien, so I couldn't go. I couldn't get a clearance to go. So I was transferred to the Medical Dental Detachment at Fort Bliss, and the unit deployed in August or thereabout, or July or August. And in November, I get a letter from the guy that was from Vermont. And he said, at the beginning of the month, they gave me a $300 civilian clothing allowance. They sent me up to Garmisch at the Army Recreation Facility up there. They put me in a hotel kind of setting. Maid came and cleaned the room twice a week. And they said, your job is to teach skiing for no less than 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. And I was to be doing that from when I got there until we ran out of snow in April or thereabouts. And he said, by the way, how's Fort Bliss? I cried. So that was my second little story about starting out in not real good shape with my alien at that point. So after I'd been transferred to the Medical Dental Detachment, I started my application to become a citizen. I went downtown to the courthouse, etc. I was assigned to the what's called the shot clinic, the immunization clinic within the Medical Dental Detachment. And I was working for a Spec 5 who was probably about 12 to 14 years in service, and his name was Gordon Hoare, and it's Horr. And Gordon rode around on a scooter and lived on base, and he had been there about 3 years or so, and he knew a lot of people on base, or on post, I should say. And about 3 months after that, he had come down a levee for orders for Germany. Also, just before he did that, he changed his name from Gordon Hoare to Gordon Warr, I think it was, W-A-R-R. And the reason he did so was because he and his wife had just had a young girl, and they did not want her to grow up being called young Hoare. So you understand his change of name. Now, actually, no, it was Carr, not War. He changed it to Carr. And before he left, however, I had made Spec 4 in. No, I hadn't made Spec 4. I made PFC in April, and then I made Spec 4 exactly 3 months thereafter, which was the minimum they allowed, because he had come on orders. And they put me in charge of the immunization clinic as a Spec 4 with not quite a year in service. And I had one guy working for me, and he and I were responsible for administering immunizations to all the soldiers and dependents on post that were on orders to go someplace, etc. And our facility was co-located like one building away from the, I forget what the correct name for the place was, but it was commonly referred to as a VD clinic. And that is where most of the soldiers who had visited the other side of the river from El Paso, Juarez, would come to receive treatments after they had been involved with the ladies of the night in Juarez. And every once in a while we would have to go over there and help them on Saturdays just to pull our duty, because we were sort of under the same group. And upstairs from us was the preventive medicine officer that was over that area, and he was responsible for trying to find out who the or where the infections may have come from. So he he was responsible for going to Juarez and getting pictures of the various local ladies of the night. And he was a young second lieutenant, Medical Service Corps, and he sort of took a liking to me, and the two of us and a couple of other guys, we all jumped around together, and we would go over there, and for entertainment we would take pictures of the ladies of the night and come on back, and we would have a good time doing so. But now that I was up to Spec 4, my annual pay, or my monthly pay, was $123 before tax and $110 after tax. As a PFC and Spec 4, between the time I got there and basically January of 1962 and September, I guess it was August or September, I'd saved up $500 on that pay, and maybe a little bit of playing poker. And I went home to New Jersey, and I bought myself with my dad's help, a almost brand new car. And that car was a 1962 Volvo Fastback, and it had 5,000 miles on it. And I paid $2,000 for it. And it was one of the best cars I've ever had. But I drove that back to Fort Bliss, and of course I paid for it myself. My dad wouldn't do that, and the car payments were $60 a month, and then I had to pay insurance of $30 a month. So in a take-home of $110 a month, that left $20 a month for entertainment. And I decided, well, maybe there's a better way. So I found two friends in the barracks that didn't have cars and didn't have intentions of getting some. So we made an agreement that they would pay for gas and I would drive. And at least 5 nights a week, if we went out that often, I would drive. And if they wanted to drink, they could drink. And then on one night out of the week, one of them would drive, and if I wanted to drink, I could drink. And most of our off-duty hours were spent either in Juarez or on some of the GI areas outside Fort Bliss. Dyer Street comes to mind, or in Sunland Horse Racing Park across in New Mexico. And you had different closing hours at the various bars based upon whether you were in Texas or in New Mexico. New Mexico was normally 1 or 2 hours later. And if you still wanted to stay out, Juarez didn't have closing times. So there were a few times and we would come in time for our morning formation, which would be at 5:30 or 6. But we somehow or other made it through. And I stayed there at Fort Bliss until I believe it was in February 1963 when the Cuban crisis came. And for the Cuban crisis, most of the Army stateside was alerted to do something or go somewhere. That happened at Fort Bliss as well. And if you're alerted to go somewhere, you have to have all the immunizations you're supposed to have to go to the various places. So we were immediately instructed to administer shots to everybody on base, basically. Knowing that we can work 12 or 24 hours a day, we were told that the first day our job was to, my assistant was to administer shots, and I was to decipher who needed what, and also to teach someone else how to do that. So I did that, and at about 6, 7 that evening, 1800, 1900 hours that evening, one of the people that I trained during the day, he was taking over to do it during the night. And my Sergeant First Class, my NCOIC of the dispensary service said, "We'll see you in the morning." I said, "Fine." And I left and I went out somewhere or other, and in the morning I came in at 0700. And he said, "Where in the hell have you been?" And I said, "What do you mean, where have I been? I'm coming to work like normal." And he decided that that was not what he thought, so he submitted me to my company commander for an Article 15 non-judicial punishment. And the company commander gave me 7 days restriction to the barracks on my honor. And having not developed a whole lot of honor yet, I decided that I went out, maybe not the first night, but at least the second, third, and fourth night, and the fifth night or so, as I'm coming back into the building. And this was after working, 12-hour days every single day, administering in excess of 40,000 shots. My first sergeant's waiting for me, and he said, "Ron, where in the world have you been?" And I said, "Well, out." And he said, "Well, we've been looking for you." And I said, "Oh." And they had a levy for me to go to Fort Rucker, Alabama. But before I could go, he decided that I didn't quite fit in with the previous instructions from the company commander, and decided that they were going to file some little bit more formal charges against me. And my NCOIC had so much faith in me, he had his greens pressed for my court-martial. And the company commander, however, saw that it wasn't quite that serious, and he gave me 2 hours of extra duty for 14 days, which amounted to scraping wax off the floor in the barracks for 2 hours a night, and making sure that I was under the direct supervision of the charge of quarters. So I got through that, and then I went to Fort Rucker, Alabama. Fort Rucker is the home of the Army Aviation, and at that point they were in the process of building up for the war in Vietnam and constituting what later became the 1st Air Cav Division. And I came in there as a medic, and they assigned me to be a medic that would take what we called a cracker box ambulance, which was the old Korea ambulance that you see on MASH. It looks like a cracker box. And we would drive those out to the airfields where the helicopters would practice landing and taking off. And we could basically sit there and watch them land and take off all day. And there had to be 2 of us there in order to do that. And what we would normally do, one would sleep, one would stay awake. And at this point I was still a Spec 4, but I had gone over 2 years in service. I was up to something like a take-home of maybe $140, $150 a month. But I said I'd like to have a little bit more money, so I went to work as a bar waiter and bartender at the Officers Club on post. And that helped with a little bit of extra income. And I worked there, and I was assigned after about 6 months in the job out at the airfields. I was assigned to the eye clinic where they had an opening, and the eye clinic was myself as Spec 4 and another Spec 4 named Jim Cannon, and we worked for 2 doctors, one ophthalmologist and one optometrist. The ophthalmologist was Dr. Ralston, I don't remember his first name, and the optometrist was Dr. Oakley, William Oakley. Both very nice people. Dr. Oakley I think stayed in the Army and retired from the Army, and Dr. Ralston left the Army and went to Detroit to continue his medical expertise. But both very nice people. And Jim Cannon and I basically did everything that we were supposed to do at the clinic, and we developed some interesting rules. We serviced both dependents and active duty, and in fact Dr. Ralston did a fair amount of operations on small children, primarily for eye corrections, and where you change the muscle of the eye in order to have them going straight instead of turning or whatever. And we had a chance to go to the operating room with him and somewhat assist as necessary, and that was very interesting to me. And how little most physicians who had not gone through any kind of specialty in eye knew about the eyes was also very interesting. if someone came in with a eye injury where our doctors were not available, the doctors would send them over to see either Jim Cannon or I for first aid, rather than to treat them themselves. That's the extent that they knew. But anyway, I left Fort Rucker in July of 1964, and I will say that during the 64, from what's called Alabama Educational Association holiday, which is the winter break for Alabama, which is normally in late January, early February, until I left at the end of July, I managed to get to Panama City, Florida, at least one day every weekend between those two dates. And that was 100 miles door to door, so my Volvo got a lot of usage. And had a great time down there. And when I left in July of '64, as I drove out the gate, I gave the gate and the sign of the Army, what you'd call the bird, as I was leaving, and said, "That's the last I'm ever going to see of the Army." And I had applied and been accepted to two colleges in my parents' home state, New Jersey. One, I still have no idea why I got accepted, but I did, and why I did not attend. That was Princeton. And the other one was Rutgers, which I did attend. Rutgers is the State University of New Jersey, but fairly difficult to get into at that point as well. I think the reason I got into or was accepted by both schools was because I was a little different in that I had I was an immigrant, and I was a little bit older. I was a veteran, and my test scores, my SAT and ACT, had been decent, though my grades sort of stunk in high school. But I ended up starting out at Rutgers for the fall of 1964, and I immediately tried out for the freshman soccer team, and I was made the team starting there. And I had various classes that I was okay with until I came into, I think it was something in one of my math classes that just completely threw me for a loop. And not being wise enough in the ways of college, rather than going and seeking the help I should, I decided that I was going to drop out of college. I'd also been looking for a part-time job to help support myself going through, and I had not found one. And my parents, again, could not really afford to pay for my college. So anyway, I dropped out and went down to the local recruiter, same recruiting office as before in New Brunswick, and which also is where Rutgers is located. And I told him I wanted to go back in. And he said, "That's great." He said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to go to OCS, Officer Candidate School." And he said, "Well, we can't guarantee you that." I said, "Okay. What can you guarantee?" He said, "That you can come back in." I said, "That's great." I re-enlisted for 6 years, which when you re-enlist, you get a 1 month's pay for each year of re-enlistment. I figured 6 times whatever I was making at the time, and I did make E5, Spec 5, before I left Fort Rucker. So 6 times monthly pay is twice as much as 3 times my monthly pay. It wasn't that bad in math. So I re-enlisted for 6 years, and they asked me, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "I'd like to go to either Fitzsimmons General Hospital in Denver, or Letterman Hospital in San Francisco, or Fort McArthur, California." And they said, "That's great. We'll re-enlist you and put you in for orders." And when my orders came back, I was assigned to Rodriguez Army Hospital in San Juan, Puerto Rico. So much for asking for and see what the Army will give you. And it wasn't actually at the hospital. I was assigned to the Armed Forces Examining and Induction Station there. That was not a real terrible bad job to be in. Although we were doing drafting people at a pretty high rate. This was in late '64. I re-enlisted at the end of October in 1964. We did do a lot of in processing, and we had, I'm guessing, somewhere around 20 to 25 people assigned to the examining and induction station, out of which probably 10 or 12 of us lived in the barracks. And these were the old Caribbean-style buildings. We were on the 3rd floor. We overlooked what is now El Moro Castle, and that used to be inside the a military base called Fort Brooke, and B-R-O-O-K-E. And most people have not heard of Fort Brooke, but that was also the headquarters for the Caribbean Command, and which was headed by a one-star general at the time. And that he in turn reported to the commander of what is now USARSO, Southern Command in Panama. And while there, our group that lived there at Fort Brooke, and the people who worked at the AFIS, depending upon where the troops or the inductees, the examinees, I guess you'd call them, were coming from, depending upon when we would start our workday. If they came from locally, they would normally be there at no later than 7:30 in the morning, and would be up and starting by 6 o'clock or close to it to prepare for it and get it ready. However, if they came from the western or southern side of the island, they may not be there until 10:30, and so we would sleep in a little bit. But the good thing about starting early, we'd be done early. So if we started at 7 o'clock in the morning, we would normally be done or no later than 1 o'clock, and we'd have the rest of the day off. If we start at 10 in the morning, at 10:30 in the morning, we might not be done until 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And if we were off, we could walk into Old San Juan and catch a bus and go down to the El Condado Beach area, which is a big tourist area. And that's where we spent a lot of our time. One of the things that had to happen for me before I could attend officer candidate school, I had to get a recommendation of my new commander. My new commander at the AFIS station was an infantry captain named Dale Bergston. Excuse me. And his name surfaces later in my armor career. And come about May, he agreed that he would sign off on a recommendation. So he did. Well, prior to him signing off on that, through a friend of mine that I was working with, I'd met a young local girl named Olga Matos. And at that point, I had not taken heed to my father's advice when he put me on the plane at what was then, I don't know if they had changed it to JFK yet, or if it was Idlewild Airport, but in New York City. He put me on the plane and said, the last thing he said to me, "Now, don't you bring home one of those senoritas." Well, be that for whatever reason, I brought home a senorita, and I ended up marrying Olga Matos in September, before I went to OCS, and I went to OCS immediately after our honeymoon.
What year was that?
That was in 1965, in September of 1965. And I left her behind with her parents in Puerto Rico, and I went to Fort Benning, Georgia. Her dad, by the way, had served in the Spanish-American War and had retired from the military as an E5. I had an inkling that he might have done pretty well in the military, even though he was an E5, because he'd been a supply sergeant. And being a supply sergeant in those days, might have been able to garner him a few special favors, which I have to regress a little bit because I forgot to give you the follow-up on Gordon Carr at Fort Bliss. Before he left, he took me around to every warehouse at Fort Bliss where he knew someone, and I learned how to do the Army way of trading and acquiring items of interest, and what you needed to have in order to do so, and such things as a six-pack or case of beer or a couple of cans of coffee could do wonders for acquiring paint, extra fatigues, extra medic white uniforms, or various other things. And it was something that, again, was to hold me in good stead later on in my career as I received my commission. Back at Fort Benning, I reported in there to Officer Candidate School, and Army Officer Candidate School at that point I think we had only one school. No, we may have had two. May have had Artillery Officer Candidate School as well as infantry. And at Fort Benning, we had one battalion with 6 companies in September of '65. By the time we graduated from OCS, which was the following March, Fort Benning had 3 more battalions of each one of 6 companies. They'd also formed up and beefed up Artillery OCS, they had Engineer OCS, and I think they had a couple of other branch Officer Candidate Schools as well. And this was all in the build-up and preparation for Vietnam. In the following my commissioning, which at times I had a wee bit of doubt about, in March of '66 I did get commissioned, and my dad came down from New Jersey for my commissioning. I was then assigned to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, to the 196th Light Infantry Brigade, with a whole bunch of my classmates went to the same place. And also regress a little bit, go back to the Christmas time while in OCS. We were given leave to go home during Christmas. And the trip home was eventful in that we started out with 4 of us riding together in a car that got us somewhere in Virginia, where the car broke down hopelessly. We ended up hitchhiking into a town, taking a bus, and then taking a train from from Washington up to New York, and then coming home on a bus. So that was a little bit a roundabout way of getting there. So at home I decided I needed a car. So I bought a 1954 Chevrolet convertible. It looked gorgeous, beautiful baby blue, very nice looking white top. Interior was immaculate, and however I didn't do a good job of checking out the engine, nor did my dad, and he said he was as much at fault as I. But I drove that and full of gas and water and oil, etc. As I left New Jersey, headed back down, and I got to the Baltimore Tunnel, and I couldn't hear the other cars because the engine was making so much noise. So I stopped on the other side, and sure enough, there was no oil in there. There wasn't much water either. So I got to the first gas station, and I bought 2 quarts of oil, and I filled up with 2 quarts of oil and 2 gallons of water, and about every 200 or so miles thereafter, on my way down to Fort Benning, the noise would start, and I'd put in 2 gallons of water and 2 quarts of oil. A short answer, I made it to Fort Benning. And there was a good reason for having a car at Fort Benning. We could not put any of our extra stuff in our lockers in our rooms because the standards were pretty strict during OCS, and you want to make sure that you pass inspection. So the cars became the storage place for all the additional junk. And in January, not too long after I came back, they had a record freeze at Fort Benning. It was 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and everything froze, including almost everybody's cars, because people didn't see the need of having a lot of antifreeze in there. And the ones that froze blew their freeze plugs. I didn't have that problem because there wasn't any water in there. So all I had to do was wait until it warmed up again and fill up the car with 2 gallons of water or more, and the car ran fine. And I bought it in New Jersey for $150, and when I left in March, I sold it before I left for $125. So my storage cost me $25 for 4 months or whatever. Also some stories about OCS. One thing that you have when you go through OCS, you have team building, some forced, some natural. You are not allowed to have various things in the barracks, some of it being extra food. And we would have what we would call pogie runs. And pogie bait is anything illegal in the way of food. And we would make various battle plans. In fact, we'd write operations orders in order to manage to get that into the barracks. The pizza delivery people knew all about this. They went through this with every class. So when you called and said, we are ordering 20 pizzas and we want to meet you at the corner of X Street and Y Street and only deliver it to the guy who blinks his flashlight 3 times, they knew exactly what you were talking about. And the courier would then bring it in, and it would normally end up in somebody's laundry bag, of course camouflaged, and it would go to the side of the building, and you would hoist it up by rope, and you'd bring it in through the roof, etc. So you go through those kinds of things that our TAC officers knew existed and would try to intercept every now and then, but would let it go. I do remember one time when it wasn't our platoon that was intercepted, it was our 6th platoon. And the TAC officers just, 4th 6th platoon was Lieutenant Pepper, and he was a little short guy with an Napoleon complex. And he just took all the pizzas and said, okay. And everybody did their normal thing of making sure that all their floors were immaculately polished in the morning before they left. Once they had left, he took the remainders of the pizzas and took them up to all the rooms and took them upside down and ground each pizza into the beautifully shiny floor, so that when you came back that afternoon, you had no less than an hour or no more than an hour before you had to have all of the floors back in the same shape. Remember that one quite well. Our TAC officer was Lieutenant Murphy, Bill Murphy, and he was not a sadist, and he was genuinely cared for our platoon and the members. And in fact, many of the guys became friends with him later on after we had been commissioned as well and were stationed with him. Pepper, however, there were people who looked for him in various places in Vietnam, hoping that they would be, that he might be in their line of fire. Don't think that happened. Going to Fort Devens, Massachusetts, I brought my wife and new daughter, Monica, to Fort Devens with me. We lived off post, and when we came in and reported in, we found this apartment, and Olga spoke decent English, but not perfect, but she did not yet have a driver's license. So we managed to get her down to the local place there and get a driver's license so that she could drive the car. And when I reported into my new assignment, I was assigned to 2nd Battalion, 1st Infantry, The battalion commander was Colonel Weddle, and the Command Sergeant Major was Command Sergeant Major Black, who was one of the first Command Sergeant Majors in the Army. And there were three of us coming in at the same time, and Command Sergeant Major Black had us seated in his office before we went in to see the old man, Colonel Weddle, Lieutenant Colonel Weddle at that point. And he said, "Gentlemen, I just want to give you some of the rules for this battalion. One of my rules is that all second lieutenants and below belong to me, if you let me. However, if you go along with that, I think you'll appreciate it." And the two other guys had not served much in the Army before they went to OCS, and they sort of looked at each other like, "Who is this guy, and what is this?" Having been around senior NCOs, I knew that that was a very valuable lesson. As it turned out, I was assigned to Delta Company, and I became the anti-tank platoon leader. Don't remember which of the guys that came in with me, but they were assigned to other companies. The anti-tank platoon leader had been Lieutenant Mattioli, Ron Mattioli, and Lieutenant Mattioli was being transferred to F Troop as he was a cab officer, and he was going to be a platoon leader in F Troop. The 196th overall had been what they called a train and retain unit. They had formed a cadre back in the fall of '65, about the same time I started OCS, and they had received all of their troops immediately from the reception station. The cadre then put the troops through basic training and AIT, and where I came in, when I reported in March, they had completed AIT and had completed some of their small unit training. Fort Devens is a very small post, and they could not do much more than small unit training on post. They had also gone down to Camp Otis, which is down by Otis Air Force Base, close to Cape Cod, and now I think it's Camp Edwards, and done some training down there. But they now were preparing to go to what was then Camp Drum, New York, which is now Fort Drum, New York, in upstate New York, north of Syracuse, close to Watertown, New York. And we're going up there to complete company and battalion and brigade type training. And we were also told what our mission was going to be. We were training to replace the brigade of the 82nd Airborne that had gone to the Dominican Republic and been on a peacekeeping mission since then. And we were going to go down and replace them. And that was also one reason why we had such things as an anti-tank platoon. The anti-tank platoon had 8 106mm recoilless rifle mounted on jeeps, and they're very good weapons for fighting in built-up areas, such as cities. And we're in Dominican Republic, they were primarily in Santo Domingo. So we thought, great. My company commander was Art Lorca, a captain. The mortar platoon leader was Bruce Wicks, and the executive officer was Eli Toney, and the I guess was recon platoon leader was Chuck Schaus. And we later also, Chuck changed to become the XO when Eli Toney did not go to Vietnam with us, as he went to his basic branch, which was transportation. And Paul Cahill came in and became the recon platoon leader when Chuck Schaus became the executive officer. So we all went by motorcade up to Camp Drum, New York, and we were training up there and shooting at ranges, etc. And whenever we were in the field, when the battalion commander and would come out to visit us to see how we were doing. He would normally come with our company commander, Captain Lorca, and the Command Sergeant Major, Sergeant Major Black. And this is where Command Sergeant Major Black's basic tenet would pay it off. He would always guide the battalion commander over to see the platoon sergeant, while he would come over to see us, the platoon leader. And he would say, sir, if you would take care of this, this, and this, and this, and know about these various things, by the time the battalion commander comes over to visit with you, you will do well. And I said, thank you, Sergeant Major. And I would quickly brush up on whatever he told me to do. And in so doing, I came out pretty good with battalion commander and company commander every time he came around. So that was very helpful. But I was also quite lucky in my first platoon sergeant. His name was David McMullen, and he was commonly referred to as Sgt Mac. And Sgt Mac was a black guy. He was about 6'3", and weighed probably 240, 260 pounds. And he probably caused a little bit of havoc in his younger days. At this point, he was in his mid-30s or so. He's a sergeant first class. And I gained a little extra respect for him shortly after I had taken over the platoon, when I went to my office, which was on the second floor of another cement barracks. And I came around the corner when I heard some noise out there, and I saw Sergeant Mac holding one of our troops up by the front of his shirt, like about right here, at straight arm. And he held him about that high off the floor, and he said, son, when you decide to be a good boy, I'm going to let you back down. And after that, I decided it was a good thing I had Sergeant Mac, because I didn't have any trouble with my troops at all. He taught me lots and lots about being a second lieutenant, and about caring for my troops, and about just being a good soldier, and what that took. And we were progressing well up at Camp Drum. The anti-tank platoon did well. Then on 15 June, our brigade commander, Colonel Francis Conity, had gone down to Dominican Republic to coordinate our relief of the brigade of the 82nd. On the way back from Dominican Republic, he was told to come by Department of Army in Washington, and he did, and at which time he was given a change in orders. And instead of going to Dominican Republic, we were going to Vietnam. Well, that was really good, because while we were at Camp Drum, in fact it was the 6th to the 8th of May, we'd gone through our final field training exercise in approximately 6 inches of snow. And of course, that's really what you need to do in order to train to go to Vietnam. But on the 15th of June, then, when he came back and he got the whole brigade together and gave the new orders, they were also told that everybody could start their deployment leaves immediately, of those who were going. And our company commander, Captain Lorca, also was assigned to be the rear detachment commander, and he picked me to stay with him amongst other people. Each company had representation, but he was the senior person. And which meant that our schedule was a little different. We did not go on immediate deployment leaves, we waited some. And instead of going by boat from Boston on 15 July, we were to fly on the 8th of August. And the people who went by boat on 15 July, they went by, the equipment and the troops went by train from Ayers, Massachusetts, outside Fort Evans, to the Boston Harbor, and loaded on and left. They made one stop in Long Beach, California, before they landed at Vung Tau. That was the longest sea deployment in Army history. 30 days at sea on 2 old broken troop ships, and I was very happy that I flew at that point. We left, like I said, on 8th August. Before I left, my wife and daughter flew back to Puerto Rico and stayed with August's parents there while I was in Vietnam. My deployment went by C-141s, and we left out of, I believe it's Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts, and we did not have what you would call passenger seats. We had the plane was loaded with various vehicles and equipment, etc., and we had troop seats along the side of the aircraft, and sometimes there was room enough for us to lie down.
Okay. Ron, I'm going to ask you to stop here because we're running out of time on this tape, and I'm going to need to